Well, let me move to a fourth task, which I suppose is the most obvious one at all. This is at least the way I would like to refer to this, and it's the task of making peace with middle age. To make peace with middle age, which in my mind means this. I accept the fact that in some ways I am no longer young. But I also accept the fact that in many ways I'm not really old either. There's a lot of newness in my life. And if I can make peace with both of those realities and let go of what I need to let go of and embrace what I need to embrace, then I'm making peace with middle age. Now, to try to be a little more specific about this, I would like to suggest that there's at least 3 experiences that we start to have in our lives, in our late 30s and on through the 40s and maybe the 50s, that keep telling us we're not as young as we used to be. First of all, one of those experiences which we all have is the experience that I can't do what I used to do. Or physically, I'm not able to be what I used to be. So there are physical signs of the fact I no longer have at my disposal what I used to. Now, let me try to be even more specific. You may be very familiar, maybe very personally familiar, with the 3 most common physical ailments of persons in the mid-years of life. Let me just mention these. Weight control is one. That's certainly an issue that comes to the surface more in the mid-years. A second one is hypertension or high blood pressure. That's also a physical statement of the fact that I'm getting older. And the last one is arthritis. 3 most common ailments of the mid-years that kind of say to us our bodies do not work exactly the way they used to. So that's kind of a signal to us. Let me get even more specific, if I can, about this and mention some other physical changes. I really shouldn't do this to you, but I will. For example, did you know that height decreases after age 24? Or 25, 24, 25. After those years, we actually start to shrink a little bit. It's a welcome thought, isn't it? Our reaction time, our physical reaction time peaks in the early 20s and then decreases. We don't react as quickly. However, it's very interesting that some studies suggest that people in their mid-years are less accident prone, which is to say that we compensate by foresight and experience. In spite of a lower reaction time. Some other things, hearing peaks at age 20 and then begins to diminish. Well, I think I've said enough. But let me say one more. Let me say one more thing, and that is interesting study I read recently, which is kind of hard to believe, but I'll just pass it on to you. It was done by a West Coast university studying illness, the frequency of illness in people's lives. And they concluded, hypothetically, that in the middle years of one's life, the 40s and the 50s, there really is no higher incidence of acute illness than there is in the 20s and 30s. There is no more frequent acute illness, which seems to suggest that there is an acute illness in a person's life. It's likely to turn up oftentimes before them. Now that's the good news. The bad news is that there is more chronic illness. So we might say it's not that you get real sick in the mid-years, it's just that you're kind of sick all the time. Okay. Well, that's enough in terms of physical signs of, that's plenty. Let me mention a couple of other signs that, in fact, I'm not as young as I used to be. A second is the burgeoning awareness that most of my life is behind me, which suddenly we start to become more aware of. Most of my life, at least in terms of number of years, is behind me. And so a person starts to think of how much time do I have left, or what will I do with the years that are left. That's saying to me I'm not as young as I used to be. And that's healthy if I allow myself to recognize that reality. And the third thing I'd like to point to that clearly begins to say to us, we're in the mid-years, is this. Many people close to me are no longer around. My parents perhaps have died, maybe close friends of mine, people who have been significant to my life are no longer around. They've died. They've passed on. So that's saying to me, I'm no longer in the young years of my life. So, making peace with middle age means, first of all, I allow myself to feel all these experiences and to embrace that as it is. Let me give an example to you, if I might, of a man I know who I think was really wrestling with this fine man, again in his late 40s, not in this area. This was a man who frequently shared with me his dreams. And the dreams that he would talk about were often dreams in which he was climbing mountains, swimming long stretches of water. Had a dream where he was swimming the English Channel, frequently riding motorcycles. Now, this is a man who's 47 years of age, who was a little overweight. His hair was almost completely gray. And in his dreams, he was always doing very youthful, vigorous things. Plus, almost all of his friends in his life were in their 20s. Both men friends and women friends were all people in their 20s. And I remember asking him, I said, don't you have any friends you like to associate with who are in their 40s? And he said, very honest, he said, no, he said, people in their 40s are just kind of boring. Now, a good man, but in many respects, having a hard time making peace with middle age, having a hard time acknowledging the fact that he really was 47. And the younger people that he associated with saw that struggle clearly, often felt sorry for him, and yet he was still trying to relive the 20s or 30s. So it's a task obviously not easily negotiated. Now, let me say that the other half of this is recognizing that there are some ways in which I am still young, or that there's a lot of new opportunity in my life. For example, in three ways. First of all, in the mid-years of one's life, there is more awareness than ever before. There's new awareness. I'm more aware of things. I'm more aware of myself, very likely. I have new awareness, new understanding, more than I've ever had before in my life. And that's gain, and that's potential for a lot more in my life. And secondly, what is clearly the case is most people in the mid-years of their lives have more power and influence than ever before. In the 40s and the 50s, more power to really influence things in a family or in a workplace or in church or wherever it might be. These are the years when we have more power and influence. And if we can seize upon that as the opportunity of these years, then making peace with the loss of youth might not be so difficult. And lastly, also more freedom in some respects. In some respects, more freedom. One of the great examples of that, of course, is what in the literature is usually called the empty nest syndrome. The children have grown up, they're now beginning their own lives, and there's a great deal of loss in that, but there's also new freedom, new opportunity. If I can make the turning, make the conversion that's necessary, and move on with a new dimension of my life. So there is new freedom. In all those respects, it's recognizing that the mid-years are far from all loss. They're also a time of great gain, if I can make that transition. So that is a rather central task of these years. Now, we have two more to mention. Let me mention the fifth. I believe this is a very interesting and significant task, and that is to become a mentor for others. The word may sound a little strange, and this is drawn very much from Daniel Levinson's studies and suggestions. He maintained that one of the great lacks in American society today is that there are too few men and women mature enough to be mentors for others. Now, what does it mean to be a mentor? It basically means to be a person who is comfortable enough with himself or herself that they can guide the next generation into the adult world, that they can nurture them along and show them the way, both relationally, both professionally, and also religiously, perhaps. It means, in other words, that I can become a guide for bringing the next generation into the adult world. And Levinson's contention is that too few people really seem to have this capacity. Now, to be a mentor, in other words, means that I have to have a capacity for what Erik Erikson calls generativity. And he says this is the great adult virtue, the capacity for generativity. And to be a generative person is to be able to use the power and the influence I have in my life for the sake of others. So it's obviously the great Christian virtue of agape, or love, to use my power, my influence in the service of interests that go beyond myself. To use my power and influence and authority to help usher the next generation into their lives, to help them become their own persons. Now, the difficulty with this, for all of us, I think, is that to be a mentor in the truest sense of the term, I have to have a pretty well-established identity. So here we have a great example of how, if I've not quite negotiated that earlier life task of establishing my own identity, I will not be able to be a mentor for others. I simply won't. If I don't have a capacity for relating intimately or honestly or openly or vulnerably with another person, I will not be able to be a mentor. Because in all my dealings with others, what I really will be doing, know it or not, is refurbishing my own self-image. Now, let me give a couple of examples of that. I'd like to suggest that frequently what replaces true mentoring is one of four things. I think we see this a lot in the workplace, for sure. And if there's any place we have a tremendous need for good, mature mentors, it's in the workplace. But it takes a very integrated person to be that for others. Now, I think one phenomena that we see at times when a person really is not mentoring is competition. So you get the phenomenon whereby an older person does not really usher along, encourage, invite, and support a younger person. Consciously or not, they compete with them. I'm competing and trying to show that I still have it, or that I really know more than this younger person, or that they're not going to bump me out. And it's really a struggling for identity, which most of us do. Because I'm not really comfortable with my own identity, I'm always kind of competing with others in order to refurbish it and bolster it. So I don't mentor, I compete. A second kind of phenomenon we also see very frequently is authoritarianism, where a person or persons use their power not to call forth the growth of other people, but to reaffirm my own significance, to reaffirm my own unsettled identity. And what you get is authoritarianism. I need to keep telling myself and telling you that I'm in charge and that I know best. And we see this obviously in all institutions. We see it even in the church, if you can imagine that. So wherever we're struggling with identity, and a lot of my sense of my significance comes from my role or my position or my power or influence, and I need to keep asserting that over other people, there's no way I can be generative or mentor another. Now, a third example, maybe even more common, is paternalism and maternalism. Paternalism and maternalism. And what happens in that is you have a fundamentally good person, oftentimes living their life over in the life of a younger person. I want them to have all the opportunities that I never had. I want them to not make the mistakes that I made. And it can be well-intentioned, but what really is happening is I'm living my life over in theirs. And I'm not really able to allow them to create, to define, and to discover their own way. I think one of the great examples of this certainly in our society today is in the whole area of sports and athletics, which all of us have been through and are familiar with. And it's the phenomenon where you find, especially fathers, pushing their sons, I guess their daughters increasingly now today, to kind of be what we might feel we never were. And it's kind of living our life over. Well-intentioned, but oftentimes because we assume that's what's going to be best for them. And that really is not mentoring. So whenever we too much believe that we know exactly what will be best for the younger person, sometimes we do, but when we think we know exactly what will be best for them, that can border on paternalism or maternalism. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't give advice, because obviously sometimes we do know what's best. But when that becomes a pervasive way of being, then it may start to look like paternalism or maternalism. I like very much the way after one of these talks, a woman came up to me afterwards who was, I believe, 70 years of age. And she told me a recent conversation she had with her daughter, who was 40. It was her daughter's 40th birthday. And she said, I'll never forget what my daughter said to me on her 40th birthday. She said, Mother, I just want to tell you that the happiest day in my life was when you stopped being my mother and started being my friend. Rather interesting. When she really felt that her mother was kind of a mentor or a friend to her, able to allow her to live her own life, to make her own decision, her own mistakes, and to be with her in the midst of all of that. Now, that sounds to me a lot like mentoring. Okay. Let me just mention one last example of non-mentoring, and that would be conservatism. The tendency or the need to conserve or preserve traditions, even though another generation or another person may not find them helpful. And if I have a great need to conserve or maintain or preserve things exactly the way they are, then I probably will not be able to mentor, because I will not be able to assist another person to maybe discover their own values, their own customs, their own norms, their own approach to life. So very firm, very rigid conservatism is opposed to mentoring, I think. Just want to say that as I look at some of the great, I guess perhaps all the great religious figures of the world, almost all of them were great mentors. Certainly Jesus, Mahatma Gandhi, Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena. They were all people who kind of had disciples around them, but they all were very free in relating to their disciples. Did not tell them exactly what to do, but allowed them to kind of discover themselves what their lives would be. I don't think any of us do that perfectly, but we're always, I hope, striving to be able to mentor a little better. So that's certainly a major task of these years of one's life. Now that leads us to the last task I would like to mention, which quite frankly might be the vaguest of all, and yet I'm going to try to talk about it anyway. This is a much more explicit religious task, and that is to experience God, to begin to experience God in my life as an inner reality. And that may sound quite vague. To begin to experience God as not only outside of me somewhere, external to me, but to begin to experience the fact that God also resides, if you will, within me. That I experience the movement of God within me and within my experience as an inner reality. This is what we talked about the first night when we talked about the fact that the Spirit of God is the life force within every person. It's what St. Paul says over and over again when he says, "Do you not know you are temples of the Holy Spirit who is within you?" In these later years of one's life, the mid-years, I believe a fundamental religious task is to begin to have a growing sense that the life of God, the Spirit of God, is within me, and that I need increasingly to listen to that and respond to that, vague as that may sound. Now, what that means oftentimes more practically is that I begin to listen very seriously to the feelings, the urges, the desires, and the emotions that rise up within me. And I begin to believe that that is a principal way in which God reveals himself, herself to me. St. John of the Cross in the 16th century once said, I believe I may have mentioned this before, that our feelings are the language of God to the soul. So if I want to hear how God is speaking to me, I need to listen to the ebb and the flow of my own feelings and emotions, which is also a central teaching of St. Ignatius. And I begin to believe that God speaks from within myself. As one author puts it, it's listening to the voices of the deeper self. This is a fundamental mystical teaching that's very firmly established in our tradition. St. John of the Cross also said that God truly is the deepest center of our self. Mentioned before that Thomas Merton, who may be a saint someday, writes a number of times, when I find my truest self, I will have found God. So it's to experience God as an inner reality, speaking oftentimes to me through my own feelings, emotions, desires, needs. And if I can receive what God is saying to me, I will grow in freedom and wisdom and love. Now, to exemplify this just a bit more, I'd like to allude again to the quotation I believe I referred to previously from St. Catherine of Siena in her book, The Dialogue, where she asks God at the beginning of that book the great question, what must I do to come to know you, the source of eternal life? You may recall God's response to her was this, never leave the knowledge of yourself. Then in the valley of humility, you will know me in yourself. And from this knowledge, you will draw all that you need. So, it's beginning to experience God as an inner reality. And when I am in touch with that reality within myself, then I will be my best self or truest self. Now, I believe that if this is happening in a person's life, it usually expresses itself or gets revealed in at least two things that start to become apparent. And those are the last two things I'd like to mention. One thing that begins to happen usually is that a person begins to become a critic, if you will, of the very institution of which they are a part. You seem to identify with that somewhat. So a person begins to recognize and clearly acknowledge the fact that sometimes God speaks to us and moves in our lives in ways that are not perfectly embodied or expressed in the church, for example. And we begin to recognize that some aspects of our religious lives, some practices, some beliefs are very culturally influenced. Quite obviously, in Western Christianity, a person would clearly need to come to recognize that the subordination of women in Western Christianity has been a cultural influence. And I believe the movement of God speaking within people is saying that so much more clearly today than ever before. So we begin to recognize that some aspects of our institutional religion are not yet the kingdom of God, are not the fullest expression of mystery. And so a person who is now listening to the unique way in which God speaks to me is able to criticize the very community that he or she is a part of. One author says that it is no longer possible to be a true believer, a believer who no longer at times stands apart from the institution. It's a very challenging time. Let me, if I might, just read to you one example of that. I'd like to quote again the case study that I think I referred to last week of a young woman who, at the time this case study was done by a student of mine, was in her 50s. And she was a religious woman, a sister, a member of a religious community. This is how she was described, I believe, when she was roughly in her mid-40s. Actually, I think this is set in the present moment. So the student who interviewed her describes her situation in this way. Anne, which is not a real name, finds herself outside or at least beyond structures in her life, the institutional church and her own congregation. Her values and beliefs are sometimes shared by few in either institution. She finds this also to be the case often with those with whom she works, as well as those with whom she lives. Her support comes from the few persons with whom she shares a common vision, and from her family, especially her sister, with whom she is very close. One suspects from being with her and talking to her that her primary support comes from a deep inner strength that gives meaning to her life. She spoke of long, agonizing struggles to leave both the community as well as the church. Now she finds that she is able to live within both, while in a certain sense living beyond them. Now, I think that describes the kind of religious believing that oftentimes begins to emerge at this time. So I think that's one thing we begin to see. A second phenomenon that also begins to illustrate or express being in touch with the God who also dwells within me is the fact that a person begins to look for and respect the wisdom in other religious traditions. A person begins to look for, respect, honor, and be interested in the wisdom that's to be found in other religious traditions, other Christian churches, non-Christian religions. And why? Because they believe that God, in the truest sense, resides within all of us. And so any person who is trying to respond to God and live a good life will show us a piece of the truth. And so we have much to learn from other religious traditions. Nothing to fear, but in fact, much to learn. I think this was the intent behind the ecumenical movement which began in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. I'm not sure that it's at all been realized or that it's moving forward at all today. But the assumption is that we can afford to begin to dialogue with other religious groups and look for the wisdom that they image to us. That is something that a person believing in this way will not have a great deal of difficulty with, but in fact will find energy for, because we're always looking for a little more insight into the mystery of God's action in human life. So I would like to illustrate this openness to the wisdom of other religious traditions with the example of a man 72 years of age. And this is a case study done actually by a student of mine who interviewed this particular man. And what he says is very reflective of this openness to the wisdom of other religious traditions. This is a direct quote. He says, "I have learned to have respect for anybody. I could sit down and talk to a Mohammedan or a Jew or an Arab or anyone, and if they start talking religion in their way, I could really and completely fit my mind to theirs, see where their mind is going, and understand their ideas. Perhaps to some I might say, I myself see life differently from you, but that is just the difference between our approaches." So I believe that those words of this 72-year-old man do reflect this openness to the wisdom to be found in other religious traditions that we're talking about. Those are the tasks I wanted to share with you tonight. I think we can see that all of those tasks have to do with the three components of the life structure we talked about, namely profession, work, or career, love and family relationships, and lastly, religious belief or a vocation. And all the tasks have something to do with making adjustments in all of those areas. So having shared that with you tonight, I think we can close and look forward perhaps to the late years next week.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.